What is up, everybody? Coach Connor here with the first episode of 2023 for Strength Coach Rants, and today we're going to be talking about the core, or your core. So after taking a month off, figured it was a good time to get back in front of the mic and start talking about some things, and I thought, what better way to start off the new year than talk about the core, right? Everybody's got their new year, new me resolutions and all that. Core training is something that's kind of misunderstood by a lot of people as to like how to do it, when to do it, how much to do it, what to actually train, and all that. So we're going to go over all of that today. All right, so for starters, what is the core? Now, you may be thinking to yourself, it's the six-pack abs. That's typically what people think of when they think the core, but it's so much more than that. Realistically, your core is anything that attaches to your spine or to your hip. And you could probably think of it easier as anything between your nipples and your knees. So we're talking about like your rectus, that's your six-pack abs, your obliques, which you have two of, your interior and exterior obliques, our transversus abdominis, our multifidus, our lumbar extensors. I know I'm forgetting a whole bunch, but then, some even less known ones like your glutes, your hip flexors, your quads and hamstrings are technically core muscles. The lats are a core muscle. So there's a lot more to it than just, getting on the ground and doing some crunches. If you're really trying to develop your quote unquote core, there's a lot of different things that need to be done in exercises that need to be incorporated and different angles that have to be kind of attacked if you're really going to get the most out of your core training that's going to have, functional benefits and body composition benefits as well. So if you've ever been involved in fitness, whether it's, just going to the gym, reading the magazines, getting on social media and Instagram and seeing the Insta thoughts and Insta chads and listening to them trying to better yourself in the gym, you've probably heard at least one person say core training is the most important part of your training, right? The core is the most important thing. If the core isn't there, then nothing else matters. And while relatively reductive, that's not false. The core is responsible for a lot of things. For one, it helps keep us upright. It's a force transfer. It allows for rotation and bending of the torso. It allows us to have more mobile hips and, believe it or not, more mobile shoulders. We'll talk about those in a little bit here. But the core is responsible for a lot of things. So, when we're training the core, it can't just be crunches, Russian twists, things of that nature. We have to incorporate some very base level, I guess what you could perceive as base level type training if we're going to get everything done within the core that we need. That means training our transversus abdominis. That means training both the inner and outer obliques. That means training the rectus, doing crunch variations, things like that. And we have to think of it more that way as opposed to grabbing a med ball and doing some Russian twists or getting on the decline sit-up machine and absolutely blowing out your hip flexors. There's a lot more to it, and we're going to go over kind of beginning to end what needs to be done within your training if you're going to get the most out of it. So these are the different ways that when I work with athletes that we train our core, right? So we have our movements. Those are crunch variations, sit-up variations, dynamic plank variations, stuff like that. Then we have what are called anti-movements. And these anti-movements are things where we have to maintain and hold position. So the easiest anti-movement that you've probably heard of is the plank, right? That's just the base level plank. We are trying to hold and maintain a position, right? We're not going through a crunch or a side bend or anything like that. We're trying to maintain a position for time, right? And that's an anti-movement. Now, some of these movements can be weighted. There are plenty of ways to do unweighted body weight movements. Some can be done for reps. Others can be done for time. Some can be done while going through movements, and others can be while we're on the ground, right? So there's an infinite ways to train your core. And in all honesty, if you want to have the strongest, most bulletproof core possible, you're going to have to train all of these different stimuli to be able to accomplish that. All right, so the first category of exercises that we're going to talk about are our anti-movements. All right, these are the ones where we want to hold a position and maintain a position for time or reps, depending on what we're doing. These movements, believe it or not, are the ones that are going to make you stronger. They're going to really engage your core and allow you to better transfer force. So these can be dead bug variations, pillar variations, plank variations, single arm dumbbell hold variations, dumbbell holds through movement, anything where you're trying to not allow your body to move and maintain a neutral spine. So, for instance, dead bug variations, people may say this is a movement-based exercise. However, it's really not. What we're trying to do when we do a dead bug, right? We're on our back, our hips and knees are at 90 degrees, and we're letting one leg drive out and then bring it back in, opposite leg back in. What we're trying to do through that movement is maintain a neutral spine. So as your leg goes out, right, and your arm goes overhead, your lats and your hip flexors are pulling on your lumbar extensors, right, or your lumbar spine. Right, your hip flexors via your psoas, which attaches to like the very bottom thoracic vertebrae and some of the top lumbar vertebrae. And then your lat actually attaches to the thoracolumbar fascia and attaches in those same places. So as we lengthen both of those, it's going to pull on our spine, and we have to engage our core, our abs, our TA, all of that, in an effort to keep our spine neutral. All right, so this is still an anti-movement, even though we are going through movement while we're doing it. All right, another one, pillar variations. Right, so all a pillar variation is a plank on your hands. Right, so think push-up position instead of being on your forearms. That's a pillar. Right, once we get good at these, we can kind of go on to plank variations. Again, we have lateral planks, we have front planks, we have dynamic planks, we have front planks where we can do single arm raises, single leg raises, different plank variations on physio balls where we go through movement. Those are all designed to kind of force you to engage your core to maintain a neutral spine. So even though through some of those movements we are moving, those are anti-movement exercises. We have single arm dumbbell holds, right? Those can just be standing. We can do suitcase carries. We can do hunched over like a single arm dumbbell row hold, all right, and fight that rotation. We can do power lock presses, right, where we take a cable, we push it out, and we try to fight that rotation. That's our body trying to maintain a neutral spine. And then we also have like single arm loaded lunge variations. All right, so as we go through these lunges, we're going to have to maintain a neutral spine. We have weight on one side, it's pulling us that way, and we want to fight that pull, and we also want to not pull off in the other direction. There's a couple videos on our Instagram page where you can see some of those, and I may go back through during editing and put some of those in here just so you guys can see them for those of you watching. But those are all exercises where we want to maintain a neutral spine. Those are the exercises that are going to have the most benefit and carryover to your sport for the most part, outside of if you're a rotational athlete. So we want to spend most of our time on these anti-movements. Think of these anti-movements as the cake, right? And then the movements kind of being the icing on that cake. All right, so before we really get into any of the high velocity type movements where we're throwing med balls and all that stuff, we've got to set a base, and these anti-movements are really the best way to do that. All right, so one more thing about these anti-movements that I kind of forgot to say in that last segment, these are great to incorporate into a warm-up for cues. All right, so maintaining a neutral spine and staying nice and tight are amazing movement cues for any time we're doing anything with an axial load. All right, so whether we're overhead pressing or we're squatting or the deadlift is still kind of somewhat an axial load. Anytime we're having to transfer force from the ground all the way through our body into an object, these exercises are a great way to cue your body to be in good positions to do that. So when you use these, when you're doing lower extremity lifts, squatting, deadlifting, any lunges, any of that kind of stuff, even jumping, starting off with some of these anti-movement exercises is a great way to cue you into neutral spine and being able to transfer force more efficiently. All right, so the next category of exercises that we're going to talk about are the movement-based exercises. Now, these are crunch variations, sit-up variations, anything where we're rotating or bending or flexing, extending, anytime where we're actually moving, that's a movement-based exercise. So, nothing like planks or pull-up presses, none of that is considered movement-based, right? So when we do these, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because I'm sure that you know all different kinds of exercises you can do to kind of target your abs and your obliques. What I will say is there are a couple exercises we want to stay away from. We really want to stay away from sit-up variations, and we actually want to stay away from like violent leg lowers or leg raises or whatever you want to call them. sit-ups, because they are actually mostly a hip flexor exercise. They're hip flexion. If you watch yourself do a sit-up, what's actually happening is there is flexion at the hip more so than anything else, right? The abs get worked through a very small part of that, and then they continue to fire as we're going up through that range of motion. However, it's mostly hip flexion. Those leg lowers, those violent leg throwers and V-ups and things like that, we want to stay away from those. One, because they are kind of anti-movements as well. A leg lower is or even worse, you've got people in the gym, they'll partner up, somebody's on their back, legs straight up in the air, and their partner is like violently throwing their legs towards the ground, and they're slowing it down and bringing it back up, right? Horrible exercise. For one, it's not targeting your abs at all. For two, it's very dangerous. So that's actually an anti-movement variation of a straight leg lower, which is a variation of a dead bug. We talked about dead bugs in the last one, and if you remember, your psoas, right, attaches onto your femur, and it comes down and it actually attaches onto your lumbar spine, your lumbar vertebrae, and as your legs go down, right, it starts to pull. Once you hit like the end of your capabilities, it starts to pull on your lumbar vertebrae, and that's not a good thing, especially if it's done violently with somebody throwing your legs towards the ground as hard as you can. So it's an exercise you want to stay away from. Again, sit-up variations you want to stay away from. We want to do things like lateral hip bridges, different Russian twist variations, crunch variations, anything that actually targets those really three muscles. So your internal and external obliques and your rectus abdominis, your transverse abdominis to a little bit lesser of a degree, but you want to target like your stomach and low back muscles and not your hip flexors. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is like when to incorporate core training into your training program. One thing I like to do on upper body days is start off with some core. So instead of like running over and hopping on a treadmill, that gets like super stale and boring. I like to do some movement-based core, right? So I can kind of blow my quote-unquote core out prior to doing upper body stuff, as long as I'm not really going overhead, and it's not going to have that big of an impact on my overall performance within the lift, since there's not nearly as much force transfer going through like your trunk as with lower extremity stuff, and it's not as dangerous, at least. So I do my movement-based core prior to lifting, doing upper body stuff, and then a lot of times I will incorporate some anti-movements into my warm-up for my lower extremity. And the reason I do that, one, is it's not going to wear me out. I use it more as a cue than anything else. So I'll go through some single arm loaded lunge variations. I'll do even some like suitcase carries, some relatively short suitcase carries, things like that, and like some reverse hyper holds, anything where I'm trying to maintain a position, because it's going to cue me to stay tight when I go to put a bar on my back. So I like to incorporate some of those, anti-movements prior to getting under a bar and squatting or deadlifting. That's how I like to do it. A lot of coaches will kind of push it off till the end of the workout, but I mean, realistically, I'm 38 now. I really don't care that much anymore for my own training. If I push it off to the end, I'm probably just going to skip it. So I like to use it as part of like just my general warm-up, instead of going and hopping on a treadmill or on a bike and doing something that's going to bore me to tears. I can engage myself a little bit more by doing some core. I can get my blood flowing, I can get my internal temperature up, and I can cue myself for the rest of the lift. So that's how I like to do it. I do that with all my athletes as well. We've seen it be incredibly beneficial for us. So that's when I would recommend doing it. If you're Gen Pop looking for body composition and not really looking for performance, then you could probably incorporate them at any point within your lift. But if your goal is performance in addition to, body comp and having a strong core and all that kind of stuff, I would do it at the beginning of the lift, because it's A, you're going to do it. You're not going to be too tired not to do it. And B, it's a great, easy way to warm up. All right, so last thing we're really going to talk about as far as programming goes is how do we progress core, right? So there's a couple different ways you can do it. If you're using a weight for any of your anti or movement-based core, we can always increase the weight, right? That's a great way to do it. We can have volume progressions. We can do time progressions for the exercises that we're doing that are timed. Any of those holds, many of those also can go up from a weight perspective. One thing I will say is try not to fall into the trap of volume-based progressions, right? So if you think about it, maybe early on when you were training, benching 135 was pretty difficult, right? But you didn't just continuously bench press 95 pounds more and more and more and more and more in an effort to get bigger or to get stronger, right? What you did was you had a progressive overload and you added more weight as you went on, maybe changed, the volume here and there, but it wasn't a volume-based progression because you would eventually, that will wear itself out. You can only do so many reps before the carryover essentially stops. So I would say if you're doing an exercise that is weighted, a weight-based progression is awesome. Time also, that's going to wear itself out. If we're doing dumbbell holds or we're doing planks, there's no need to hold any of those for longer than a minute. It's just there's no point in time where you're going to have to do that. But plus if you're doing a plank the way it's supposed to be done, you should not be able to hold it much longer than a minute. You're going to get out of position. You're going to get overextended. You're going to, protract. There's a lot of different things that can happen within this movement, and a volume-based progression more than likely will kind of take you to those places that you don't want to be as far as position goes. So try to have it be like a load-based progression, after you've kind of like set your base. So in the beginning, like if we're doing, 20-second planks, yeah, we can hop up to a 30-second plank. We can do a 45-second plank, but eventually those time progressions and those volume progressions, let's say we're doing a Russian twist and we start off with 10 and then we go to 12 each and then we go to 15 each. Eventually, like the benefits really kind of cease to exist. So you have to increase the load if you're going to get any stronger or any better, right? So stick to, in the beginning, stick to some volume-based progressions. And then as you get, better, you can start to kind of increase those load progressions and have a lot more success. As far as like progressing goes, right, there's only so many core exercises we can do. We can manipulate the different variables. We can, increase, again, the load. We can increase the time. We can increase the volume. We can increase the difficulty by changing the movement ever so slightly. There's a lot of ways that we can do it. But if you really want to have, progression that lasts and progression that gets you to where you want to go, you're eventually going to have load increases to really get where you're trying to go. Volume progressions, they wear themselves out really, really fast. All right, so an example of this kind of progression, let's use a Russian twist because it's relatively easy. Say your first day in the gym, you start off, you're going to do 10 each side with, let's say, body weight, right? Doing 10 each side body weight, and it kind of digs into you a little bit. The next time we go in, we either hit 10 again because it was pretty challenging, or we can up the volume to like 12, right? So we get to where we're doing 12 each side, all right? We get a little bit accustomed to that. We adapt to that. So now we go to 15, doing 15 each side. All right, so now, in the beginning that was hard, and then it started to get a little bit easier. Now we're adapted. We can grab a weight, right? But we don't have to stay at that 15, right? Because we grabbed a weight. It's tougher. So let's backtrack back to 10, grab a 10 pound plate or a 15 pound dumbbell, and we're going to do 10 each side, right? After 2 weeks or so, that's going to get a little bit easier. Let's go ahead and bump it up. Let's do 12 each side and then 15 each side. Then, all right, well, this is pretty easy now. I've adapted. Let's grab a 25 pound plate. We come back to 10, right? We do that. We adapt to that. We go to 12 and so on and so forth. So I guess when I say, volume progressions wear themselves out, there is some volume progression kind of built into it. I don't want you to stick with like comfortable weights or body weight movements and just continue to do more and more and more reps, right? Like honestly, like 100 sit-ups, right, isn't going to do much more for you than 20 would once you become adapted to it, outside of like it probably destroy your hip flexors and you'd be walking around like a troll for a while. But try to think when you're hitting these progressions, you can still do volume-based progressions, but we have to like have load be a factor at some point in time, because we can't just do more reps forever. Hopefully that makes sense. I just wanted to clarify on what I said in the last segment. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit more about some of the benefits of core training. I know in the beginning I had mentioned shoulder and hip mobility, and there's a reason for that, right? So if we lose our ability to kind of move in certain ways, we tend to either gain or lose movement at the joints above and below. So when our core gets really weak, our hips actually get really tight. A weak core a lot of times will allow for more movement that we don't want, and not the right kind of movement, but stiffness where we really want to be. It's actually really interesting the way it goes. So like if our obliques get really weak and we lose the ability to rotate, right, it actually has an impact on our thoracic spine, which has an impact on our scapulothoracic joint, which has an impact on our shoulder joint. So if our obliques aren't strong enough, it can actually really hamper your bench gains, which is kind of wild. And the same thing being said for the hips. If we get too we get too much movement, too much mobility, like in our lumbar spine, we're going to lose a lot of that mobility in our hips, and our hips are going to get really tight. And, it's crazy to kind of think about it that way, but when I said earlier, like it was a little bit reductive, but it's 100% true. Like if your core is out of whack, it really kind of renders everything else next to useless. You can still like progress, but if we're not where we need to be, it's going to be really hard, and it has an effect on a lot of things. We transfer forces through our core. When we're sprinting, when we're jumping, when we're benching, even when we're squatting, we're putting force into the ground, right? And the ground is reacting back through us. So that force has to come through our trunk into the bar, right? So if we're not strong in our core, we get a lot of force dumping there. That's A, when people get hurt, but B, you're going to be leaving pounds or inches on the floor, meaning you're not going to jump as high or you're not going to squat as much. So it's really important to understand that, if you really want to get the most out of your performance, your core has to be able to fire and do the things that it needs to do. We have to be able to brace properly. We have to, a strong core is going to allow us to go through movement. In other podcast episodes, I've talked about how, like mobility in the hip is not usually like a flexibility issue. It's normally a strength issue. So we lose strength at those end ranges, we actually lose mobility. Your body's not going to let you get into positions that it doesn't believe that you're going to be able to get out of, right? Same thing with the core. If we lose that rotation, we lose a lot of other things. I lose strength at my end ranges. With that rotation, I lose thoracic mobility. Like it's crazy. It's really, really important for a lot of reasons. So again, increased mobility, in mobility, not just in our, our joints, like our shoulders and hips, but mobility in our trunk. You want to be able to bend down and pick something up without blowing your back out, being able to sneeze without blowing your back out. That happens to people, so the possibilities are pretty huge. So if you want to be able to jump higher, run faster, bench more, squat more, and you want to be able to reach across your body to grab the remote without blowing your back out, a strong core is an absolute necessity. All right, well, that's going to do it for the first episode of 2023. We talked about the core. There's a lot more stuff to talk about this year. Hopefully you learned something, as far as what the core is, why we train it, the benefits of it, how to train it. Today wasn't really an episode, that was for like giving you exercises to do. That's really going to be kind of up to you. There's a lot of trial and error when it comes to programming for yourself, and what works for me may not work for you. What works for my athletes may be different than what works for me. Everybody's a little bit different. So, get out on the floor, try a couple things. Just make sure, we're doing not just the movement-based core exercises, but the anti-movements, because those are going to be the ones that really kind of help take you to the next level as far as your performance goes. We'll be back next week. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. All like 30 of you that listen. We'll be back next week. We'll get back into the routine of doing things. I know we took that month off, a little bit over a month since before Christmas, but we're back in the swing of things, and we'll see you next time.